There are 4,000 cities in the world today that had a population of 100,000 or more in the year 2000. You see them there in black dots. Every one of these cities is unique and one of a kind, just like you and me are unique and one of a kind. But if you're like me, when you become ill, all of a sudden, your wish to be unique and one of a kind disappears. What you really want to have is a common disease with a common cure, not a unique disease. Cities would be in the same predicament if there was some kind of a science of cities, which, like medical science, looked at general phenomena that are common to all human beings rather than whatever is unique to each of us as individuals. Unfortunately, such a science of cities does not exist. This book is the first attempt to look at all the cities and to see what we can learn when we look at all of them at the same time. And my interest in doing that is not scientific. I'm not a scientist. I am an urban planner, and I've been working for decades in cities in developing countries, trying to find out how to deal with their housing problems, for example. So my interest is in getting people to understand how cities expand and how much they expand and why we need to do something about it. And not surprisingly, I found that people are not aware of how much and how fast cities expand. And in fact, the prevailing paradigm is to combat sprawl, namely to have cities not expand, but rather be contained. In general, since the 1990s, urban planning in North America and Europe has been guided by a paradigm which I would call the containment paradigm, also known as smart growth, growth management, or the compact city paradigm. The essence of this paradigm is that the expansion of cities, often called by the derogatory name sprawl, should be contained, and that instead the existing areas of cities should be filled in and densified to accommodate all or most future population growth. This paradigm may be appropriate in North America and Europe, where urbanization is largely come to an end, but I believe that its adoption in countries still undergoing rapid urbanization is highly inappropriate. I will take the few minutes allotted to me here today to examine some of the evidence. For a more comprehensive look at the evidence, you will have to consult my book. The main reason why the containment paradigm is largely irrelevant in rapidly urbanizing countries is that it fails to take into account the magnitude of the expected urban expansion in coming decades. Let me begin by an historical example. In 1811, New York contained 100,000 people living on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. That year, the city adopted an expansion plan, a grid plan, that expanded its buildable area sevenfold. Sevenfold. How many cities can claim this audacity of vision? By the end of the century, all of this new area was largely built up, densities almost tripled, and the city became overcrowded as never before. New York then annexed its four neighboring counties, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Richmond counties, now known as Staten Island, in 1897. In 1900, it adopted a grid plan throughout the new area that again expanded its buildable area sevenfold. This area was filled up in only 30 years as the population of New York quadrupled. And it was filled up with suburbs. Densities everywhere quickly declined, and overcrowding became a thing of the past. Again, I ask you, how many cities can claim this audacity of vision? Together with colleagues, I examined the expansion of a global sample of 30 cities from 1800 to 2000, cities from Buenos Aires to Chicago, from Shanghai to Cairo, and from Paris to Lagos. On average, these cities expanded 16-fold during the 20th century. 16-fold. How could the expansion of these cities have been contained? So here, you see Paris in 1800, during the time of Napoleon. It was 11 square kilometers and it had 500,000 people. This is Paris in the year 2000, at the time of Pompidou, where it had 10 million people and it was 2,000 square kilometers. So the population grew 20 times, the area of the city grew 200 times. This is one of the historical maps used in the analysis showing Paris in 1832, and you can see the built-up area. This was done by a British do-gooder organization called the Society for the Dispersion of Useful Knowledge. Sorry, the diffusion of useful knowledge. Okay, we also examined the expansion of cities between 1990 and 2000 in a global sample of 120 cities. And we found that that is approximately 3% of the 4,000 cities in the world today with populations of 100,000 or more. The built-up area of these cities grew on average at twice the rate of their population growth. Why? Because of the persistent decline of urban densities. And that decline occurred because of increasing incomes together with the availability of cheap transport. This is what happened, for example, to densities in Manhattan. So on the top, you see the densities in 1910, and on the bottom, you see the densities in 2010. So you can see that they're a lot lower. Even though we have taller buildings, we have a lot fewer people living on the island today compared to the number of people that were living here in 1910. And you can see the particularly high densities in the Lower East Side, which are on the bottom right of the top picture. And what is happening in Manhattan is global. It's not just happening here. It's happening in Europe. It's happening in developing countries. It's happening everywhere. And given present density trends, when the urban populations in the cities in the developing countries doubles in the next 30 years, their urban land area will triple or quadruple. And just as we cannot stop people from coming to cities, there's little prospect that we can stop cities from expanding. There is no evidence to date of any city that has succeeded in adopting policies that has resulted in significant densification. We found that even in Portland, Oregon, a city that has adopted an urban growth boundary since 1979, built-up area densities have declined significantly during this period. You can see it in this graph here. This is the urban growth boundary in Portland. You can see it here in the picture. This is how the boundary is drawn. This is development inside Portland, and this is a rural area outside. And still, even though they put a belt around the city, these densities between 1973 and 2005 keep going down. They keep declining. So this dream of densification that the containment paradigm hopes for is really not happening. And if containment in Portland, a city with a strong regulatory regime, has failed to create a more compact cities, it is highly unlikely that containment will be successful in cities with weak regulatory regimes and weak rule of law. We found that these are the cities that will experience rapid urban population growth. They are also the cities that already have high densities, that use low levels of energy per capita and have low carbon emissions. These are the cities that cannot possibly benefit from containment and densification as cities in North America, for example, possibly could. I worry that if containment in rapidly growing cities is indeed successful, then it will create land supply bottlenecks. This is what happened in Seoul, Korea, for example, in the 70s and the 80s. These bottlenecks led to increased land prices and quickly extinguished any hope that new land and housing on the urban periphery will remain affordable to low-income groups, and even to not-so-low-income groups. Strict containment also leads to the demolition of the homes of the poor, as it did in Seoul and as it does in China today, to replace them with housing for the not-so-poor. China, which now effectively contains urban expansion in the name of food security, is already experiencing a very serious housing affordability crisis. I also worry that if containment is unsuccessful, as it is likely to be in countries with weak regulatory regimes, then urban expansion would take place in a disorganized, inefficient, and inequitable manner. More specifically, when cities expand without adequate attention to public works, arterial roads that carry public transport and trunk infrastructure will be in short supply. These arterial roads cannot come into being in a laissez-faire market. Bangkok, for example, suffers from a massive shortage of arterial roads, and as a result is one of the most congested cities in the world. This is a slide of an area in northeastern Bangkok that has developed in the 60s and the 70s, and what you see is this is an arterial road, and this is an arterial road, and this is an arterial road, and the distance between them is 8 kilometers, or 5 miles. So there's no public transport anywhere inside here. All the public transport is here, and over here you have to use tuk-tuks, basically these kind of motorcycles like the top one, to bring you out to the main road where you can take a bus. Bangkok also doesn't have a citywide piped water network, nor does it have a piped sewer or a storm drainage network. In other words, its infrastructure networks are a disaster. Failed containment will also result in the near absence of public open spaces. Witness São Paulo, for example, one of the largest cities in the world, where there's 1,500 square kilometers of built-up area with no open space at all. Just developers building more and more projects, and the public unable to do anything about reserving certain areas for open space. This, just by the way, in contrast to New York City, where, I usually give it as a riddle to the people, and I'll ask you too, how much land do you think is in public use in New York City? What percentage of land is in public use? 50%. 50%. This is the bastion of capitalism. 50% of the land is in public use, in streets, in major infrastructure, in parks, in harbors. So just so you know that markets and the laissez-faire attitude of this kind of market does not create the kind of cities that needs to be created. For this, we need planning. And we don't need to plan everything, but at least we need to plan the arterial roads. Leave some area for open space. It doesn't happen by itself. I therefore believe that instead of trying to contain urban expansion, we should come to terms with it. Instead of the containment paradigm, I propose a new making room paradigm. This making room paradigm may contain, at the very minimum, variations on 4 key components. First, a realistic projection of urban land needs. Somebody has to make real calculations. They're not being done now. Second, generous metropolitan limits enshrined in law. In order to plan for expansion, you need to have some jurisdiction that you can work within to make such a plan. These jurisdictions do not now exist. We have instead a patchwork of cities, each controlling, or small districts, each controlling a very small area. Third, we need the selective protection of open space. And fourth, we need an arterial infrastructure grid. Let me elaborate. Cities will need to estimate their projected land areas in coming decades in a realistic manner. We estimate that if densities decline by 1%, as they did half the rate of decline in the 1990s, then 31 countries, including Congo and Ethiopia, will see their urban land cover multiply by 8 times or more by 2050. 48 countries, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Vietnam, 6 times or more. And 82 countries, including India and Indonesia, 4 times or more. The New York 1811 plan for a 7-fold increase of its buildable area may not be unrealistic after all for many of these cities in these rapidly urbanizing countries. But urban land cover projections will be of little use unless they're put into practice by designating new metropolitan boundaries for cities and enshrining them in law. And these new boundaries cannot be instituted by municipalities. They need to be created by state, provincial, or national legislation. The selective protection of open space, and the emphasis here is on the word selective, is grounded in the realization that there is no point in designating an area as public open space unless it can be aggressively protected from invasion by formal and informal developers. Painting it green on an official land use map is simply not enough. So just creating a plan and saying all of this is going to be open space is not going to happen. Sad to say, I found that nothing remains of Le Corbusier's famous master plan in Chandigarh. This is Le Corbusier, one of the great architects of the 20th century. This is one of his signature creations, the new town of Chandigarh, the capital of the Punjab in India. And the essence of the plan is to create these macro blocks, and within each macro block to create a beautiful meandering open space through, so that everybody is within 10 minutes walk of open space. When you look at the Google Earth image of Chandigarh today, you find that all of these open spaces have been built upon. None of them remains. Each and every one of them was invaded. So when I talk about selective protection, I'm talking about aggressive protection using community, back to what Sally was talking about, organizing communities to fight and protect open space, naming the open space for the grandmother of the mayor, doing whatever you need to do to protect it in some realistic manner. Finally, the essential element of the making room paradigm is securing the rights of way for an arterial infrastructure grid made up of 25 to 30 meter wide roads spaced 1 kilometer apart and covering the entire area of projected expansion. These arterial roads, and these are two examples of arterial road systems. The first one on the left is Detroit, which is part of the famous land ordinance created during the time of Jefferson that divided the rural areas west of the Ohio River into 1 mile square segments. And so when cities develop, they develop within these 1 mile square segments. So you see the arterial roads, you see them all the way, you see them in Omaha, you see them all the way to Los Angeles. And then within these, you can have any grid you want. It doesn't necessarily have to be a New York type grid, but at least you have a kind of a regular grid that covers the whole area. This is the Milton Keynes, a new town that was built in England in the 50s and 60s. And what you can see here is another grid, a 1 kilometer grid, and there's indeed a bus on every one of these grids. These are the V1, V2, V3, V4, this for vertical, and this for H1, H2, H3, H4. So that's the public transport system in Milton Keynes. So these arterial roads are needed to open up sufficient lands for urban expansion so that buildable land remains in ample supply and housing remains affordable. When we don't have enough land that is brought into the urban sphere by providing it with access, only the rich get access to land. There's land speculation, land prices go up and get quickly out of reach for the urban poor, which are going to be the majority of the people that are going to be coming to look for new land and new housing in the decades to come. So they are needed to also to empower the planning of cities so that developers, formal and informal, build within a plan rather than the planners running after them, which is the practice today, and following their whims. They are needed to bring into being an efficient public transport system covering the entire urban area so that its carbon footprint can be reduced. And most important of all, their rights of way, namely the land which they occupy, needs to be obtained now, when land on the fringe is not yet subdivided and land prices are still low and affordable. It is my hope that the evidence, the analysis, and the conclusions presented here may lay the foundation for a fruitful discussion of the fate of our planet of cities and what we can do to make it a better place for a long time to come. Thank you.
You make a wonderful and compelling argument. I'm just curious, in all the cities that you looked at, is there a pattern that you observed, for instance, in your example of New York? There was a very powerful regional plan association, and you mentioned the grid plan. There were some very significant efforts made to do what you suggest is smart. What motivates or propels that kind of regional planning elsewhere? I mean, does anything that you see suggest that there's a pattern or a locus for that initiative?
Sad to say, we don't see many regional plan associations today. In fact, somehow the market paradigm that has been pushed upon us in the last few decades has resulted in weakening planning institutions, weakening government, weakening public works projects, weakening investments in infrastructure. The entire sense that, let's say, planners in Los Angeles had in 1924, when Los Angeles was growing fast, is that they needed public works, and everybody understood that public works has to go in quickly, and somehow we're going through the period where this has been lost upon us. It has to be discovered, but in truth, part of my role is some kind of a, somebody with a big bell running around, is to try to elicit this spirit. But I'm afraid that it's really not there anymore. And to the extent that it exists, it's very conservative. It's very, when you look at planning today, it's the leftists are conservationist and the rightists are conservative. And it's basically, leave things alone, do us a favor. So this kind of thinking ahead, big progressive agenda is really not on the table today. So we need to create it, because these things are going to happen, and whether we're prepared for them or not. So that spirit of the Regional Plan Association needs to be brought back into the discussion.
I have a question. I just came back yesterday from Rangoon, the last colonial city left on the planet, maybe. I mean, untouched. That's one thing good about dictatorships, that they haven't done anything, and they've mismanaged the economy. So therefore, the city, the historical city is still there. So what tools do we have these days? What international, I don't know. I once went to UNESCO years ago before all the changes came, and I said, what will it take to declare Rangoon, what do you call it? A historical, what is it? The historical site or whatever the thing. And this was about World Heritage, and this was about 10 years ago, and the guy, a friend of mine, said $200,000. Well, I wasn't working for Soros then, but it could have been, we could have done something. But now, I mean, I don't know what's left there. I mean, there are some efforts inside, but outside, how can you do anything? Is it all lost? It's slowly getting, it's succumbing to some of course, the pressure, because now it's, freedom is not always good, because under a dictatorship, many things can be conserved. Obviously, we're fighting, we've managed to move the dictatorship, but now how do we save Rangoon?
I don't have any better answer to this than anybody that has looked into it. I've been to Rangoon a number of times, and it's nice to see something that has been kind of left untouched for so long. And my idea was that the way to take care of it is to buy a lot of paint, and to just paint the houses again so that they look new. But other than that, it looked wonderful. Again, what I emphasize in my answer to your question in general is I would like to see selective conservation there. Instead of saying we need to leave this untouched, like keep it historical, I think that we need to revitalize it, remodel it, renew it, but at the same time keep adequate messages of its history there. And I also want to tell a story here, is that if you all know, Brasilia is a new town that was created in the 1950s, again by people influenced by Le Corbusier. It's a very modernist city, and it's the capital of Brazil. And this was declared quite a long time ago a World Heritage Site. The entire city is a World Heritage Site. Now, this is an awful, dysfunctional city. And there's nothing that you can do to revitalize it and to build between these super blocks and to create. So the action takes place in the squatter settlements outside. That's where all the nightclubs and all the bars and all the life goes on. And the people who work in Brasilia go to São Paulo over the weekend, right? They don't stay there. Right, so it's a dead city that had been made even deader by declaring it a World Heritage Site. So even that can be a curse. So you have to be a little bit careful by saying to Rangoon, you know, go fight to become a World Heritage Site, because it's a two-edged sword. So again, what I would say, you know, fine, protect some of the monuments, but don't kind of freeze everything and don't allow anything to happen, because cities need to be repaired all the time. They need to be revitalized and repaired and reinvented all the time in order to adapt to new conditions, new economy, new invention, new technology, new culture, new people. So just kind of freezing it in place is often not the right thing to do.
If we could come a little closer to home, since we've just had an election, and there is a great deal of talk about rebuilding. And you make such a convincing argument, but then you say, but nothing can be done. And I'm so disappointed that you don't give us a political analysis, even a speculation as to what might be a model to get policy initiatives that you say, because you use the word now, we have to do this now. So how can we do it now?
Can I get any help here from anybody? You know, I was approached by a colleague last week who is supposed to write an article in the Wall Street Journal to advise the new administration about a new urban policy for the next 4 years, right? And everybody agrees that the right way to advance is to invest in infrastructure. Everybody agrees. Now, unfortunately, the discussion has been sidetracked for all kinds of reasons. First of all, because infrastructure has gotten a bad name with politicians looking for their pet projects in their districts, you know, the famous story of the bridge to nowhere and other kind of investments. And then other kinds of infrastructure are so much subject to fashion. You know, so in Atlanta, they want to build high-speed rail. You know, so okay, so you're going to invest $5 billion in high-speed rail, and most of the Atlantans that support it hope that you'll get on the high-speed rail so that they'll be less congested on the road and they can drive their cars. But they're not going to shift to high-speed rails. And there's my friend, who is a friend of some of the people in the audience, Alain Berthaud, calculated that if you wanted rapid transit in Atlanta, you'd need 2,400 stations. You know, if you wanted the same metro like they have in Paris, right? Atlanta is Atlanta. You know, you can't make it into Paris. So what you can do is, and what I would do if I was the administration, I would create $1 trillion worth of infrastructure projects that are ready to be financed the moment there's money for it. But not these crazy projects like, or pet projects, but what is really needed as acts of repair, what I call acts of repair, to repair our cities. You know, you live in New York, you know how much repair this place needs, right? And we kind of used to it. We go to Santiago de Chile. The roads are paved. You don't have to go up and down and it's Santiago de Chile. You know, it's not. How come? So what I'm saying is we need new investments in infrastructure, and then when it comes to all of a sudden we have money, like we had during the crisis of 2008, say, well, we can't do infrastructure because the projects are not ready. So we're going to squander it away, and 10 billion out of the 800 billions are spent on infrastructure. Prepare infrastructure projects that are ready to be financed. But in truth, there has to be another spirit. There has to be a spirit, a kind of a renewal of the idea of public, and getting the young generation to believe in the public and not to be so concerned about marketing themselves or being themselves or doing their thing, but kind of understanding that there are larger things than themselves and that sometimes they have to let go of themselves and act as a public.